You all got copies of the letter from Art Tully about reducing the amount of performance bond for the landscaping work needs to be done. It's still keeping the landscaping part, but reducing the bond from 42,230 to 11,770. You all see that? You remember seeing that letter?
Yes, I did. Yes.
Anybody got a problem with that?
Wait a minute, I'm just reading it.
Oh.
I don't.
You're supposed to read ahead of time.
I did. I'm rereading it because I didn't know I was going to have to make a decision this evening.
Just getting a sense of the...
Okay.
It's fine with me. They're okay with that. Yeah.
Okay, with the additional 6,370.
Yeah.
Yeah?
So it's just basically, what happened is it fell through the cracks, and I guess, I hate to admit it, it's probably my fault. But anyway, it fell through the cracks. We were supposed to do it last meeting, so I just want to get a sense of it. So we'll pass the actual resolution next week, but as long as we're all on board, we'll get our treasurer to start working on it, okay?
And Steve, that's enough to cover, yeah?
Plenty.
Okay.
Yeah. Matter of fact, he's scheduled to do the work anyway this fall. So.
All right, thank you. Now we're going to the meeting. We're going to talk about the Greenwich Avenue rezoning and the creation of a C1 zone. We're going to suspend the rules where we have anybody who wants to chime in and talk is more than welcome. Stu, you want to start off and give us basically what we're...
Yeah, I'd be happy
what we got here? Thank you.
happy to sort of, I guess my purpose and my objective would be to just try to facilitate discussion. You have a hearing scheduled next week that hopefully begins to bring to a climax the discussion about the place of worship zoning and the OBH, the two separate local laws that you've discussed at length and I think are comfortable with them now for public hearing. Now, with among the discussions we've had throughout the various discussions on the place of worship was the fact that we were going to, the board, hope at some point, is going to consider permitting place of worship in all zones in the village except the CS zone. And we had discussions about why it was important from the village's economic base perspective and from trying to assure that the uses in the CS zone could remain and could expand and be enhanced without being burdened by the possibility that there might be places of worship in the CS1, in the downtown business area. Greenwich Avenue, which has been discussed over many years, is in the CS1, or in the CS zone, sorry. I'm talking about CS1 so much, but the CS zone, which is the same as downtown. So the way things are now, the house of worship would not be permitted anywhere along Greenwich Avenue. In addition, there have been these discussions about what the appropriate zoning is on Greenwich Avenue. It now permits all commercial development. There were some people felt that over time that maybe that could possibly work against the downtown by allowing commercial development to spread out. But the lower part of Greenwich Avenue, what I consider the lower part of Greenwich Avenue out toward 17, has a lot of different characteristics in the downtown. You know that, physical characteristics on one side of the street and on the other side of the street. They're both quite different from the main part of the downtown. So when we, as the consultants, made some initial recommendations, we thought that it would be appropriate to restrict the development along Greenwich Avenue, not so much restrict it, but change it to fit more with the residential office type development. And we reached out, we had discussions with with business people, with the chamber, and with the village board. And to bring this back to where we are, there was a lot of feeling that it was important to maintain as much flexibility as possible on Greenwich Avenue. The properties, there are a number of properties there that are still, subject to development. Hopefully the economy will get stronger and will be developed. And it's a very important part of the village, and an important part of the village's economic base. And there was a lot of feeling that we should leave it pretty much as the CS zone. But if you recall the earlier discussions about the place of worship idea, one of the reasons that we discussed not having it as CS was that in another zone, in any other zone, it would allow that place of worship, and your attorneys had also advised you that that would probably strengthen the local law, the change in the zoning, that would allow the places of worship. That is, it would be allowed virtually any place in the village. So we said, okay, we'll allow the place of worship on the lower part of Greenwich Avenue, but how do we do that? Well, the easiest thing to do to start with was to make a new zone, or suggest a new zone that was exactly the same as the CS zone, and make it a CS1 and permit the place of worship. But then, and that's as far as we have really gotten, as far as our discussions, and we took the discussions that we had with some of the stakeholders, with your board, and said, well, what other things might be appropriate in this lower part of Greenwich Avenue? And so that was the last memorandum we gave you. What's before you now really is a draft of a local law that says we create a CS1, and the area essentially below High Street would be CS1, and the only difference would be that it would allow a place of worship. And we said, well, in order to maintain the maximum flexibility, and maybe even to encourage people to do things other than just business, that maybe there should be some other things added to the CS1 zone. And that's really where we are. We had thrown out in the memo that we did from August, the middle of August, several ideas. And just very briefly, one of the ideas was simply to add to that zone permitting 1, 2, and 3 family homes, which aren't permitted in the zoning right now in the CS zone. And that, we thought, since one of the comments that we heard during some of the discussions was that, there are a number of residential buildings there. Not all of them are maybe being maintained as well as they should. There was concern about what that whole strip of the entranceway into the village looks like or might look like. And so that might encourage people who own those buildings to feel, 1, comfortable that they were permitted uses, and 2, maybe allow conversion to 2 and 3 family homes if they were 1-family homes now. Now, I know some of those buildings have dwellings in them, multiple dwellings. So the second thing that we suggested maybe you would consider, because it came up, I think even when Mr. Healy was here one night, we discussed not just the possibility of commercial uses on some of those properties, but residential uses. We already permit mixed use in the CS zone. We permit residences over commercial uses. But we don't permit just residential development. So that was a second idea, that maybe if that was a permitted use, that might encourage the reuse of some of those properties as residential properties, and it would actually maybe be an incentive not to develop them commercially over time and then further take away from the downtown. And the third thing that we had talked about was just looking at the zoning as it is in terms of some of the design guidelines. You have landscape requirements in the zoning code now, but possibly looking at how the street frontage would be addressed in terms of landscape strips along the street itself. Maybe ideas about moving more of the parking to the side and the back of the building. We didn't really come up with specifics, but suggested that we visit the design guidelines, or the design, and maybe some of the bulk characteristics of the zone. The CS zone is different than the design shopping zone in that it is more intense. The bulk the coverage is greater, but maybe it could be reviewed and like the downtown, where most of the properties are pretty much, cover a good part of the property. Most of the development covers a good part of the property. and maybe you want to look at some of those things as well.